There was a surgeon, an architect, and a computer scientist were hanging out, having a beer and just shooting the breeze. And they started talking about their professions, and then they started talking about which one was the most important, the most significant. And the surgeon said, well, you know, God was the first surgeon. And the other two looked at him, said, what are you talking about? And said, well, you know, after he created Adam, he put Adam to sleep and removed one of his ribs to create Eve, and that's surgery. And the architect kind of nodded and said, yeah, you're right, but before that, God was an architect. He took the chaos and designed and created the entire universe. That's architecture. And the computer scientist thought for a second, kind of chuckled to himself and said, where do you think the chaos came from? So, today we're going to talk about God the architect and the design of the universe. And back in April, I talked about postmodern evangelism and how sharing the gospel today is not the way it used to be. And it used to be our primary task very often in talking to the Lord about or talking to our friends about the Lord. Primarily, we were trying to convince people to live out what they already believed, or to show them the implications of what they claimed to believe. That's the way it worked for me. It was a dawning realization that if I really believed the things that I said I believed, that it should have a bigger impact on my life. And for a lot of people, that's the way evangelism worked. And so maybe some details needed filled in or adjusted, but basically we were dealing with people who already believed this stuff. Today, there are many people who just don't believe the gospel. And even a fair number of people, a growing number of people, even in the United States, that never heard the gospel. Today, the culture around us primarily approaches life from a naturalistic viewpoint. And naturalism says that nature is all there is. There is no such thing as the supernatural. And science is very often starting from that assumption. And for a lot of people, science and naturalism are their religion. And it's a religion which, by definition, God does not exist. So people will often claim that science has proved that God does not exist. But I would disagree. I would say their science assumes that God doesn't exist. And they need to look at their assumptions. So we're going to look at why they should be looking at these assumptions today. So back at the talk in April, I talked about a lot of philosophical arguments for God's existence and ways that we could use philosophy to persuade people to think about God. But at the end, I showed this guy, Francis Collins, director of National Institute of Health and leader of the Human Genome Project. And I mentioned he was at an academic conference, and he threw up this slide, which is a picture of a stained glass window in a cathedral in England. And he commented on how the beauty and the intricacy of the design in this window is a clear indication of the genius and the talent of the creator of the window, the artist that created this window. And then he put next to it a slide of an electron microscope scan of human DNA. And he said, for him, the beauty and the intricacy of the design of this DNA and of many other things he has seen in molecular biology, is just too overwhelming to believe that it happened by chance. And the clear indication of the genius of the artist who created that is overwhelming. So we're going to talk about more of those incredible, amazing evidences of the design of the universe today. Before we get started, I want to briefly define a couple of terms about creationism. I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably everybody in this room believes that the universe was created by God. So, we are all creationists. But there are two broad categories of creationists, and in a few conversations I've had, I realize not everybody is familiar with these terms, and not everybody even realizes that there are these two categories. First is young earth creationism. So people who are young earth creationists believe that in the book of Genesis, where it describes the creation of the earth, and it says on the first day God did this, and the second day he did this, and the third day he did this. Those days are literal 24-hour days as we know them today, and therefore the creation of the universe took 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested. So it took 1 week, as we know a week, for everything to be created. People who believe that, one of the implications of that, you can go through the Bible and through the book of Genesis and everything that happens after that, and there are ways to kind of pinpoint different events in different historical descriptions in the Bible and say, okay, this refers to this king, and we know from other archaeology that this king existed at this date, and you kind of pinpoint different dates and events and extrapolate through the genealogies and how old different people were when their son was born, and this person begat that person who begat that person, and you can calculate. Got to make some assumptions, but you can calculate when the creation described in Genesis occurred. And different people have done this throughout history, and today, 7,000 years ago, is a commonly accepted date for the Genesis creation. So hence the term young earth, 7,000 years. You might think that's a long time, but relative to old earth creationism, 7,000 years is not very long. Old earth creationists would say that the days of creation referred to in Genesis are really ages. And there is a little bit of etymological reason to say the Hebrew word for day can also be interpreted as an age. And people who hold this view would say what's described in the book of Genesis is kind of the broad sweeping outline of the process that God went through, but it's not a literal timeline. So first God did this, then God did this, then God did that. And so it kind of describes the fact that God created the universe in a rough sequence, but it's not meant to be, 168 hours long. So these people would say, you can't tell from the Bible when that happened. So we'll look to science, and science says that the universe is 13.7 billion years old and the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, to the best of our understanding. And we'll say, okay, that's fine. There's nothing about that's incompatible with our view of the book of Genesis. So there are Orthodox Christian believers who hold both of those, each of those perspectives. And there's nothing that I would say, well, because you believe this, you're not really a Christian, or because you believe that, you're not really a Christian. There are people in both camps that would disparage the other one, but I would not disparage either. My guess is that there are people from each perspective in this room. Personally, I don't emphatically pick one camp or the other. I lean toward the old earth creationism, but I wouldn't reject as impossible young earth creationism. So, for today, we're going to talk about the Big Bang Theory to begin with. And for the Big Bang Theory to be true, we have to have an old Earth. The science requires that the Earth be billions of years old and the universe be billions of years old. So people who would argue against God from a scientific viewpoint, they will be operating under the assumption that the Earth is billions of years old. So if we're going to engage somebody who's a scientific naturalist, to get them to go from there to young Earth creationism is a massive undertaking that's way beyond anything I could talk about today. Mainly what I'm going to be talking about is the fact that old Earth creationism is compatible with the science of cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the origins of the cosmos, or the universe. And it's kind of, and we'll see shortly, it's not that old of a science, and it's a blend of astronomy and physics. But the heart of cosmology is the Big Bang Theory. And a lot of atheists would claim that the Big Bang Theory demonstrates that we can have an origin of the universe that does not require a creator. And some people would actually claim it proves that there is no God, but technically it just proves that there doesn't have to be a God. But as I've known a few of these things over the years, but I learned more recently some things about the Big Bang Theory that I found fascinating and that most people don't know. So we'll start with this guy, Georges Lemaitre. He was a Roman Catholic priest in Belgium. He was also a theoretical physicist. And I said he's got a PhD from Louvain, which is the Catholic University in Louvain, a town in Belgium. Also Cambridge, Harvard, and MIT. And when I was reading about him, it was a little vague about exactly how his studies went and where his PhD came from and whether he studied. I mean, clearly he studied in all these places, but which institution granted him a PhD, and maybe he had 2 PhDs, or maybe some of the work was postdoctoral. I don't know based on what I was reading, but bottom line is he went to all of those very prestigious universities. Well, I don't know about Louvain. I don't know anything about them. I never heard of them before I read about Georges Lemaitre. But clearly Cambridge, Harvard, and MIT, if you're doing PhD level work at one of those institutions, you're probably a pretty smart guy. And if you're doing it in theoretical physics, you're probably a really smart guy. But what does he have to do with the Big Bang? Well, in 1927, he wrote a paper and published proposing a theory of an expanding universe. And he based his theory on work that he had been doing on general relativity. And he'd been studying general relativity and doing a lot of math based on it. And this was kind of a relatively new idea. At that point, 1927, it was only 12 years after Einstein published his paper. And a lot of people around the world, well, most people around the world had never heard of relativity at that point. A lot of scientists hadn't even heard of it. Most of the scientists that had heard of it didn't really understand it. Now, only a small group of people were actually doing work in this field at the time. And Georges Lemaitre was one of them, and as he was working through things and doing the math, and he realized if general relativity is true, it requires that the universe is expanding. And this was a radical idea because at that point in history, the prevailing theory was that the universe was in a steady state. So the stars were fixed in the skies. Everything was in one place. You know, we had lots of motion in the universe, and we revolve around the sun, and I don't know, maybe some people thought galaxies moved a little bit relative to each other, but they were kind of staying the same distance apart, just the way the Earth is basically the same distance from the sun. And, you know, we got an elliptical orbit, but we're at a relatively fixed distance from the sun, and all the planets are. And so maybe the galaxies were relatively fixed distances apart. And what Lemaitre said was, no, if relativity is true, that cannot be. The universe has to be expanding. I don't know how he knew that, but he did the math, and I didn't read about the math. The point is, in 1927, though, this was not a theory of the origin of the universe. This was only a description of the current state of the universe, that it was expanding, and it had to be expanding. And tomorrow, the universe will be bigger than it is today. 1,000 years from now, it'll be even bigger. 1 billion years from now, even bigger. And that's what he wrote in 1927. He kept doing this work and thinking about this, and then he realized, well, he's like looking forward. But then he thought, if you look backwards, relativity doesn't say the universe has to be expanding today. It says the universe has to be expanding in order to exist. So that means 1 billion years ago, it was smaller than it is today. And 1 billion years before that, it was even smaller. And if you go back far enough, if the universe has always been expanding, at some point you go back and it is so small that it's in a single point. And he published a paper in 1931 that proposed that the universe expanded from what he called the primeval atom. So primeval means first age, medieval means middle age, primeval means first age. So he meant atom not in the terms of, you know, a nucleus with protons and neutrons and electrons orbiting, but he meant atom as a particle of matter. So he proposed that there was a beginning of the universe where everything was in a single point, and that this was a consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, needless to say, or an understatement would be, this was very controversial. Nobody believed this at the time. And a lot of people thought he was crazy. Now, we'll get into a little bit later just how radical an idea this was. But let's just, for now, say some people were skeptical. And one of the people who was skeptical was this guy, Fred Hoyle. And now, he was a little younger than Lemaitre, and a bit later, about 18 years later, he was being interviewed on a radio show, and he called this theory the Big Bang Theory. And he said it pejoratively. He meant it to be a statement of how ridiculous this idea was, that the universe just exploded into existence. Now, the Big Bang Theory Incorporated the marketing team decided that's actually a pretty good name. So we'll take that, and we'll use it as our advertising slogan. Yeah, so that was 1949, and a lot has changed since then. But more recently, there was this guy, John Maddox. He was a biologist, and a science writer, and he was editor of the journal Nature. And Nature is a very prestigious academic journal. They publish a lot of scientific papers in a very wide range of disciplines. And one thing unusual about Nature, though, it's not just an academic journal. So they'll do these papers that you and I couldn't hope to understand, in all the math and all the jargon and the words. You read this stuff, and within the first 2 paragraphs, your eyes are glazing over. Yeah. But in Nature, they'll write summaries of these articles that are designed to help people who aren't experts in the field to understand what the paper's saying. And they also write a lot of editorials about science. And so it's takes the academic journal and makes it a little bit more accessible to non-experts. So he wrote an editorial called Down with the Big Bang. He was not a fan of the Big Bang Theory. Now, I learned about the Big Bang Theory in grade school. I was taught that this is how the universe began. Anybody else learn that in grade school? I was in grade school in the early 70s. John Maddox wrote this article, or the editorial, in 1989, which was 4 years after I graduated from college, which was like yesterday. Compared to 7,000 years ago, or 4 billion years ago. Yeah. So 1989, this guy was saying, no Big Bang. But the reason he wrote the editorial is there had been, in the 80s, a lot of advancements in the field of radio astronomy. And radio astronomy kind of began in earnest. I mean, it began with the first radios. Marconi was listening to see if he could pick up any radio signals from Mars. But over the decades, as radio technology was advancing, in the late 50s and into the 60s, there was a lot of radio telescopes that were invented and designed, and they started pointing massive instruments into space and listening to see if there were radio waves and maybe communications or anything coming from outer space. And through the 70s and 80s, there were great advances in the technology, and they started learning a lot of things about the universe by studying radio waves coming from the universe. And they discovered a lot of things they never knew about the universe, and some of them were pretty surprising, but some of them had been predicted. People who were studying the Big Bang said, well, you know, if this really happened, then the universe should be like this. And it was a way that nobody thought the universe was. But then they started, radio astronomy started saying, hey, you know what? That actually is how the universe is. So they were actually gaining a fair amount of evidence that maybe the Big Bang Theory was true. And in 1989, John Maddox was a little alarmed at this, and he said, hold on, everybody. And in this editorial, I read the editorial, he said this: creationists and those of similar persuasions seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. So let that sink in for a minute. Today, I have heard people say, the Big Bang shows us that there's no such thing as God. In 1989, John Maddox said in Science-Ease, basically, the Big Bang means there is a God. And you know, the way we understand, the way I grew up and the way everybody here grew up and learned science, and the perspective we have on the universe, very different than the perspective people had in 1927. Remember, I talked about the steady state model of the universe. Just like Lemaitre was saying, the universe is expanding, and at first he was just talking about right now and thought about looking forward. But then he turned around and said, well, what does that mean before? Well, the steady state model didn't just say the universe is fixed now, but the universe has always been fixed, and the universe has always existed. That's what people believed in 1927. That's what Aristotle believed. And Aristotle was kind of, sort of invented science. So for as long as there had been science, science had believed that the universe always existed. And the only people who ever believed that the universe began were the Bible thumpers and people from other religions who believed that God created the universe. Science never believed that the universe began until Georges Lemaitre came along with his primeval atom. Now, by 1989, scientists were getting all excited about all this stuff and all this Big Bang stuff, and hey, this is really cool. But John Maddox said, hey, whoa, slow your roll, folks. Do you understand what this means? If the Big Bang is true, that means that the universe began, like the Bible says. And we can't have that. Now, in 1989, in cosmology and astronomy, they were on the verge of launching the Hubble Space Telescope. And everybody was very excited about what this was going to mean for astronomy. And John Maddox was very hopeful that once we get the Hubble up there and other things that were coming in the next few years, we're going to learn a lot more about the universe. And he said he believed it is exceedingly improbable that the succeeding decade will allow the persistence of present views of how the universe is constructed. He was confident that the 90s were going to prove, yeah, that Big Bang Theory, flash in the pan, it didn't happen. Now, to me, I find it pretty ironic that the Hubble telescope was one of the major things that he thought were going to do this. One of the things that, the Hubble telescope was named after Edwin Hubble, and one of the things that made Hubble famous was the work he did that showed that the early evidence that maybe there was something to this Big Bang Theory. Well, needless to say, 30 years later, the Hubble telescope has reinforced the Big Bang Theory, not eliminated it. Okay, now I want to talk about a couple of videos I've seen. They're very short videos that give very quick summaries of science and God. First, I want to introduce this guy, Dennis Prager. He is a conservative radio talk show host. And a few years ago, he founded what he calls PragerU, or Prager University. And what PragerU does, they produce these 5-minute or less videos on a huge range of topics. Economics, politics, culture, world affairs, history, science, religion, and importantly for us, science and religion. And he's Jewish, but he's very orthodox in his religious thinking, and most of what he believes about religion and morality is very compatible with what most of us believe. So he's got these videos, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them, briefly at least. The first one is by this guy, Peter Kraft. I think a lot of people here have heard of him. He is a philosophy professor at Boston College. He's Catholic. Boston College is a Catholic school. And he's also charismatic. So he's got some great philosophy lectures on charisms and the baptism of the Holy Spirit. He's a huge fan of C.S. Lewis, and he talks a lot about C.S. Lewis. He's done a couple of PragerU videos. The one we're going to just briefly mention is God versus Atheism, which is more rational. Now, I put a URL up there for the YouTube video. You don't need to write that down. I'm going to send out a PDF of all the slides in this PowerPoint presentation, and that's why I put that in there, so you can go watch this video. What I'll say today is he talks about Aquinas' unmoved mover argument for God, which I mentioned last time. And he also talks about the theological implications of the Big Bang, the kind of stuff that John Maddox was talking about. So it's a great video, and it's only 5 minutes long, so go ahead and watch it, but that's all I'm going to say about that one. There's another one I'll get into a little more detail by Eric Metaxas. He is a Christian author. He's also a radio host, talk show host. And some of you might have heard of him. He wrote the book Bonhoeffer, which was just published in 2011. And then in 2015, he published another book called Martin Luther. And he worked for Chuck Colson in the 90s. He was a writer for Breakpoint radio commentaries. And after Colson died, Eric Metaxas and another guy took over doing the radio commentary. So if you listen to Breakpoint, he's one of the guys that does Breakpoint. My daughter Katie told me she heard an interview with him one time, and he said, you know, the interviewer was going through his resume, and he said, yeah, but the thing I'm most proud of is I was the voice of the narrator in the VeggieTales video of Esther. And he's done some writing for VeggieTales. This is his PragerU video, Does Science Argue For or Against God? And there's a link there again. We'll go into a little bit of summary of this. He starts with a famous Time magazine cover story in 1966 that asked, is God dead? And in that cover story, they quoted Carl Sagan saying, there are two criteria for a planet to support life. One is that it has to have the right kind of star, and the other is the planet needs to be the right distance from that star. And if you have those two criteria, then life can develop on that planet. And at the time, it was estimated there were 1 octillion planets in the universe, and 1 septillion of them met these two criteria. And I say SETI was optimistic. SETI stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And so there's a lot of scientists around the world, astronomers, that are actively searching for signs that there's life, intelligent life, elsewhere in the universe. And they kind of go under the blanket name of SETI. And with 1 septillion planets out there, they figured, yeah, there has to be intelligent life. And I personally have heard people say, well, obviously there's life out there. It's ridiculous to think there's not. Has anybody ever heard somebody say that? And I've actually said, well, with all those planets out there, maybe there is. The Bible doesn't say God didn't create life anywhere else. So I'm not going to say there's no life elsewhere. Well, in the years since 1966, there have been scientific advances, and especially in biology, they've learned that there are now 200 criteria, at least, that have to be met in order for a planet to develop life. One scientist that works in SETI said, in light of new findings and insights, we should quietly admit that the early estimates may no longer be tenable. So that estimate of a septillion life candidate planets out there is now down to a few thousand. So these 200 parameters that are known, not only do you have to meet these parameters, but they have to be met in very precise degrees. If you have slight variations in one parameter or another, it throws everything off. One of them that Earth has is Jupiter. So it's not just that the Earth has to be the right distance from the Sun, but farther away from the Sun, there has to be a massive planet. And what Jupiter does is, as space debris is traveling through the universe, if it enters our solar system, a lot of it is affected by Jupiter's gravity, and it will be deflected from its path and slowed down such that it'll be trapped in orbit around the sun. And I mean, this is a theory, but according to this theory, all of the asteroids, not all, but most of the asteroids in the asteroid belt are basically Jupiter's collection of space rocks. But what that does for Earth is it prevents those space rocks from continuing on their original path, many of which would have caused them to collide with the Earth and destroy any chance of life developing on Earth. So if Jupiter wasn't out there, we wouldn't be here. And so I heard one guy saying, yeah, every year at Thanksgiving when we sit down for dinner, we don't just thank the Lord for the wonderful feast and all the blessings, we thank him for Jupiter. Which is why we played that song last night. So there are four fundamental universes. I'm going to try to accelerate a bit. Four fundamental forces in the universe: gravity, electromagnetic force, strong nuclear, weak nuclear. I learned about these in school. They all have to exist to develop life. But if there is an infinitesimal variation in their relative values, it would have prevented the universe from beginning. So within the first millionth of a second after the Big Bang, these forces existed and their strengths were set for eternity. If they had been slightly different, none of this would have happened. So, and every single one of these parameters has a similar story. And all of these developments in science, remember Fred Hoyle, the guy that coined the term Big Bang? He said, my atheism was greatly shaken by these developments. He didn't give it up, but he wasn't happy. One scientist that works in SETI, his name Paul Davies, he says, the appearance of design is overwhelming. This guy believes that there was a designer, by the way. So, another PragerU video was by this guy. He was a major league pitcher, and he was an atheist, and he used to give his Christian teammates a really hard time about believing in God and how stupid you had to be to believe in God. And they challenged him to back up what he said, and they gave him some books to read and said, well, go ahead and tell us what's wrong with mere Christianity and books like that. And he realized the more he studied, he didn't have any answers, and he couldn't prove it wrong. So he became a Christian. And then he got a master's degree in philosophy, and he became a talk show host. And he did a video for PragerU. I'm going to just kind of blow by this. He basically says there are not just one Big Bang where everything was created from nothing, but there were 3 other times when something that didn't exist suddenly existed that science has to explain. Watch the video. I'm not going to have time to go through everything, but life came out. The Big Bang that we know of created matter and energy, but not life. So somewhere along the way, life had to come into existence. And once there was life, then it had to become intelligent life. And once there was intelligent life, there still wasn't human life. So human life had to begin. So you've got to come up with an explanation for all 4 of those drastic events to explain the universe. And he says, you really can't do that without God. Finally, I want to talk about this guy in a video I saw that he did. He did a long video. This is some of his credentials. Another really smart guy. He got his PhD at Cambridge, so we'll call him smart by that definition. He got another doctorate from University of Wales, another one from Oxford, and he was on the faculty at Oxford. He still is. He's emeritus. He's retired, but he was not just a math professor, he was a math fellow, which is kind of like the highest degree of professorship. And he was also a philosophy fellow, so he had 2 fellow chairs at Oxford. So this guy's really smart. And he has a video on YouTube. I saw it because he's a good friend of Ravi Zacharias, and I'd been watching the Ravi Zacharias video, and he mentioned this guy. So I went and found this guy. That video is amazing. It's like an hour and a half long. It's an hour of him giving a lecture followed by a half hour of Q&A. But he's just like sitting on stage in a cardigan sweater like this, just kind of relaxed. He's got a glass of water on the table next to him, and he's just kind of chatting for an hour about science, and it's amazing. So all I have time for is a couple of quotes that he gave from other scientists. So one is Stephen Hawking. Probably everybody's heard of him. He was for years kind of popularly called the smartest man in the world. He is definitely Einstein's current heir. He just died back in April, I think. He was a theoretical physicist and a cosmologist, and the point that Lennox was making about him was he was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge. So again, Cambridge means smart. Doesn't mean right, but it means smart. But he said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So Stephen Hawking says the law of gravity allows the universe to create itself. And John Lennox said, what's really interesting about Stephen Hawking, he is the Lucasian professor of mathematics. So he holds the Lucasian chair, or did it at the time. The Lucasian chair was named after a British nobleman whose last name was Lucas, who endowed the chair in, I think it was like 1656. So 350 years there has been a Lucasian professor of mathematics. And most of these guys were brilliant mathematicians. The second person who held the Lucasian chair was this guy you may have heard of. His resume, well, he was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge. Okay, so Isaac Newton was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, and he invented physics. He also invented calculus, or as my math teacher used to always say with precision, he invented the calculus. And he formulated the law of gravity. That law of gravity that Stephen Hawking said allows the universe to create itself. Isaac Newton, who came up with the idea, said the law of gravity is an amazing example of how God works through nature. Okay, so John Lennox talks about explanation and what it means to explain something. So he said, suppose you walked into a lab and there was a beaker of water over a Bunsen burner and the water was boiling. And you asked, why is the water boiling? So a chemist in the lab might say, well, the fire of the Bunsen burner generates heat. And the heat is conducted through the glass of the beaker by the laws of thermodynamics. The molecules of water in the beaker absorb the energy of that heat, and they vibrate very rapidly, which is what you observe as boiling. Maybe there's a technician sitting nearby that hears this, and he just rolls his eyes and says, no, the water is boiling because I wanted a cup of tea. So, both of these are explanations for why the water is boiling, but they're at two different levels of explanation. One is the scientific explanation, which explains the laws and the mechanism of how the water is boiling. The other is the personal explanation or the agency of why the water is boiling or who was behind the boiling of the water. Both of these explanations are necessary, but the personal explanation is usually more important. Usually, if Pittsburgh Dad says, "Why are all the lights in the house on?" he does not want an explanation of electricity. He wants to know who's responsible for this. So, let's see. No, there are two explanations for the universe, the scientific and the personal, and God is the personal explanation. He does not compete with the scientific explanation. So I'll leave with a final quote that Lennox gave from this guy, another Cambridge man, philosopher. And he said, "The great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing." So God and science are not in conflict. God is much bigger than science. Science, when it's done well and with an open mind, allows us, like Isaac Newton, to better understand how amazing God is.